I've got a Redux blog project here on the left, and on the right I've got Chrome DevTools open, and we're at the Network tab. Now I'm going to click a reaction emoji, and when I do, we see a couple of network requests. One's just the pre-flight request that we see here, and then the fetch request to update the data. But as I continue to click, we see that the reaction responds immediately, and then afterwards comes the fetch request to update the data. That's an optimistic update. We're going to apply that and more. Let's get started. Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we're adding RTK query with normalized cache state and optimistic updates to our React Redux blog project. I'll provide links to example source code and all resources in the description below. Please note this tutorial is not for absolute beginners in React. It is for those that already know React and are beginners with Redux and Redux Toolkit. If you are a React beginner, you should complete the React.js for Beginners full course on my channel, or one like it at a minimum, before attempting this Redux series. If you're new to Redux Toolkit and haven't watched the previous tutorials in this series, there's a link to the playlist in the description. And to give credit where credit is due, the foundation of this code is from a project in the Redux Toolkit docs, but I've modified it for today's tutorial. The starter code for today's tutorial is in the completed source code from lesson 5 in this Redux series when we last worked on a React Redux blog project. And we're transitioning the blog project we completed with Axios and async thunks in lesson 5 to RTK query with normalized cache state and even some optimistic updates. You can get a link to that starter code in the description below. Now, up to lesson 5 we were using the JSON placeholder fake API, but today we're going to switch over to JSON server, and I've already added a data folder up here in our file tree, and inside that folder is this db.json file, and you can see I've already put some users data in here, and there's also post data. So once we scroll past the 10 users, then we should have around 100 posts. Now I've modified the data some by already playing around with it, but you've basically got 100 posts here inside of this data. And of course this is with the code that you can download in the description, or you can go to the JSON placeholder site like I did and just grab the data that they have there and paste it into this db.json file. But remember, if you do that, you would be grabbing the users and making that one data array, and then as you see here I've got posts and it's a separate data array, but you can put it all within the same file, and it just needs to start out as an object. So once I get here to the top, you can see it starts out as one large object, and that's what JSON server uses. Okay, now if you don't have JSON server yet, it's not a package you add to your project, but you can install it globally like I have, or you could use npx if you're familiar with that. I'll show you what I've done, which is npm I for install, and then JSON server, and then -g, which means globally, so you could just start it from any command line like that. I've already installed it, so I'm not going to hit return there, but then after you've installed it, you want to go ahead and start it, and to do that it's JSON server, then we're going to say -- watch, then we tell it where our data is, so it's data/db.json. Then I'm going to say what port I want it to run on, and that's 3500 because it's simulating our back end. And now I'm going to press return. It starts up, it sees our users, it sees our posts, and it's ready to go. So now if I start our project, I'm going to open a separate command line to start our project on later on after we make some changes. Okay, now we're going to go into our source folder, and inside the source folder, inside the features folder that we have, we're going to create an API folder as well. So we'll create that API folder, and inside of it we'll create a new file called API slice with a capital S as in camel case, and then it's .js. Once we have our API slice, I'll paste in a little bit of code, and let's discuss what we've got here before we move on. So we are importing create API and fetch base query, and this comes from Redux.js toolkit query /React, since we're using React today. And then we say export, so we can export the API slice. We define the API slice using create API. And then here it's an object inside. Now this looks a little different than what you might have seen in my intro to RTK query, because notice we're not defining any endpoints here. We're passing a builder in, but we essentially have no endpoints right here. Now we need to have this because it's required. But what we're going to do is create extended slices so we can separate our our logic, say from posts and users for our project. And this reducer path is optional if you name it API, because that's the default. If you want to name it something else, it's not optional. The base query here is a lot like Axios, where we would define a base query, and we use that fetch base query that we import, and here we provide that base URL. Today I'm providing localhost 3500. If you were to use this with an API online, you would need to put, of course, that URL there. The tag types we're going to use with this slice right now is post. So I'm only putting post there as I'm going to give you examples for the posts. And later on, I'll let you complete the users yourself and compare that to my completed source code on GitHub. Okay, with the API slice complete, now we have a lot of work to do inside of our post slice, because this is where we're going to have our extended API slice. So we can start out now by removing some things, and we're going to remove all of those async thunks we initially created here. So we've got fetch posts, add new post, update and delete. I can just select all of those and hit backspace to get rid of them. We're also going to be able to get rid of our post URL because we're going to use what we defined already in our slice. We're not going to use create async thunk anymore, so I can get rid of that. And I believe I can even get rid of create slice. So I'll go ahead and do that as well. We're left with create selector and create entity adapter. You can see we're no longer going to use Axios either. So removing quite a few things right now. Go ahead and get rid of that blank line at the top. We'll keep our post adapter. We're going to continue to use our create entity adapter. We're going to continue to have normalized state. We're going to continue to sort the posts right here so we can have them in reverse order, or the most recent post at the top of our list. We can empty out this initial state though. We no longer need that. So let's go ahead and just make that an empty one there. And now we need to add to our imports. So I'm just going to put this underneath our import of sub from datefns. And we're importing in our API slice that we created. Let's make sure we have the correct path for that. So I'll type it again. So we're going to go up out of posts, and then we'll go into the API folder, and then there is the API slice. So yep, that's right. We'll save that. Get rid of this extra line here. And really, we're going to get rid of our post slice altogether. Even though we're really still in this post slice file, we'll still use that name because we're extending the API slice to handle that. So I'm going to select everything here with the post slice, including the extra reducers that we have down here. And we're going to end up replacing all of that. So I'll hit backspace once again. And what I'm going to replace it with is, if I could scroll over. Oh, I just missed some of it here. So what I need is an export const. Oh, I had the first part of export. That's what I was doing. There we go. So export const API slice. And now this equals the API slice we imported. And then you can see we have .inject endpoints. So this is where we will put our endpoints now. And that's all going to start with an endpoints builder. So I can go ahead and put that in as well. So here's our definition for endpoints, like we're used to seeing in the API slice if you completed that basic intro to RTK query where we created a to-do list. You saw this same structure, but it was all in the API slice. And you can see the endpoints are also here in the API slice, but we just didn't do anything with them, but you have to have them or you'll have an error. So now we've got the endpoints here with the builder, and we're ready to define any of our endpoints inside. So now I'm going to scroll up so we can see a little bit more of the screen we're going to use, and I'm going to paste in our first endpoint function here. Now, it is long enough, it took up the whole screen. So I'll save, and let's break this down. So this is get posts, meaning we're going to get all of our posts. And then we have builder.query, as we've seen before in the intro to RTK query. So we're just issuing a query here to the /posts. And of course, this is attached to that base URL that we provided in the API slice. So if we go back here, we see our base URL of localhost port 3500. So we're attaching /posts onto that and just issuing a get query for those posts. But then we're using transform response, and we're doing this for a couple of reasons here. And that, of course, has a function. So we've got response data. One is the data that I pulled into that DB JSON file doesn't have the date or the reactions attached to it because I pulled it straight from that JSON placeholder website. So if we have any of the posts that we received that don't already have that, we need to go ahead and attach that starter data to them. So what I'm doing here is defining a minute so we can increment that and use it for each post so they don't all have the exact same time. I'm going to hide the file tree, Control B, and we should be able to see more of this now. So then we define loaded posts, and this is using map on the response data. So we're just creating a new posts array here that we'll be able to use. And we're saying if the post doesn't already have date data, then set the post.date to this new date. And of course, each post is being incremented by a minute, so they're all 1 minute apart. Same for reactions. If the post doesn't have reactions, then we're setting the reactions all to 0 as it first comes in. So that's the first purpose of transform response. The second purpose here that we need to use as we're using RTK query with the entity adapter is to go ahead and normalize our state. So we need to send this new state to the posts adapter, and we do that with set all, and then we pass in the initial state, and remember we had that initial state defined already, and then we also have loaded posts. Now if I go up here to the initial state, we've got the initial state right there. Okay, and then the loaded post that we defined right here. So we're passing that into set all, and that normalizes our data. And if you remember from a previous tutorial, normalized data would have an array of just the IDs, and then it has an entities array as well. And it's really an entities object that has a bunch of objects in it in each post. And then we can use that IDs array as an object lookup with the entities when we refer to each post. Okay, then we've got provides tags, and this is a little more complex than we saw in our basic to-do list example in the intro. So what it is an array that we see defined right here. And the first entry, we're just identifying as list. It's type post, as all of these will be. But that just means we're identifying the list, and any time that we invalidate one of these tags, it will re-perform or re-auto-fetch essentially all the posts again. So if we want to get the full list, we can just invalidate the list ID. But what we're also doing now is providing an object for each separate individual post, passing the ID from the post. And we're doing that by mapping over the result, but we're also spreading it into individual post IDs here. So this is what we end up with, type post and ID for each post. So if any one of those post IDs are invalidated, it will also refetch our list automatically because this is invalidated. And that's what provides tags does. So that is our full method right there for get posts. Now also, if you remember from the intro lesson, the previous lesson to RTK query, it generates hooks. So custom hooks already based on the methods we create above. So we have get posts, so it creates use get posts query, and we'll be able to use that in our post list component. But before we move on to that component, let's scroll down and look at our selectors. Now here we have a get selectors, and it creates selectors and we rename them with aliases. We're going to leave this alone right here because we're still going to create all these selectors and rename them with aliases. Everything below the get selectors here we're no longer using, so we can remove everything you see right here. So we'll just hit backspace and eliminate that. Now I'm going to post a couple of new selectors, or paste a couple of new selectors right here above, and let's break these down. Let's talk about what these do. So the first one, as you see my note here, it just returns the query result object. It doesn't issue the query, it returns the result object that we already have from the query. So select post result equals extended API slice that we defined above, then dot endpoints, because that is an object, dot get posts referring to the method, and then calling select right there. So we're getting that result object. But that is the entire result object. It's not just the data. So then we need to use create selector, which we had already previously imported, to create this select post data. And if you remember, create selector receives input function or functions and then has an output function. So what we're passing in as the input function is our select post result query. And then our output function is taking that result and then just looking at the data property. And that data property holds our normalized state object that has the IDs array and then the entities as well. And now let's scroll just a little bit, because while we're keeping these selectors and renaming them here, we need to change how getSelectors finds the state, because that has changed. So what we're doing is we're going to use the select post data selector that we have up here. So I'll just paste this in, and let's look at what this does. We're passing the state as we were before, but now we're using select post data to say where the state is. And of course, it returns our normalized state. And that's great, but it could be null, especially the first time the app loads. So we want to use this nullish coalescing operator here that says basically if what's on the left is null, it's going to return what's on the right, and that is our initial state. And so that's the only change we need to make there, and all of these selectors will still be good. Okay, let's look at the file tree again, because we've made enough changes. We need to change our store as well. So in the app folder, we have store.js. Now we no longer have a posts reducer, so I'm going to remove that. And in its place, I'm going to import that API slice that we have created. Once again, let's make sure we're in the right place. We'd go up out of the app folder and then into the features folder, API folder, and then API slice. So that does look correct. And now down here, we don't have a post reducer. What we do have is the API slice. So I will paste this in and we'll break this down as well. So this is going to be dynamically named, but whatever name we put in that reducer path. Remember, we named it API inside of the API slice, and that was right here inside of the API slice. Optional, because that's the default, but if you named it something else, it could have a different name. And so that's why we just want to make this dynamic right here, saying API slice dot reducer path, and then it's computed if you want to use that terminology. And then we would have the value over here just saying API slice dot reducer, our comma, and then we're just going to leave the user's reducer as it is for now. But now as we use RTK query with the store, there's some required middleware. So I'll paste this in, save for the formatting, it looks right, and we'll discuss this. What this is middleware here. And the first thing we need to do is get default middleware. And that's the middleware that is already the default with Redux. So we just need to make sure we have that. And this is an array that is returned. So then we use concat. And now we're also adding the API slice middleware that we need, that API slice creates. And this middleware from API slice, it manages cache lifetimes and expirations, and it is required to use it when we're using RTK query and an API slice. Now we've finished changes in the store.js, but we also need to make some changes in the index.js. So we're no longer going to use fetch posts. We already deleted that async thunk. And in its place, we're going to import in that extended API slice once again. And let's make sure we have the correct route to that post slice here to bring in that extended API slice. So it's /features/API. Oh, it was not API, actually, it was post/post slice, because we're bringing in the extended API slice that we created in the post slice. Okay, after we do that, we're no longer using fetch posts, but we still want to get the post immediately at app load time. And so I'll just change this. We're still going to use store.dispatch, but now we use the extended API slice. Remember, it's an object, so then we go .endpoints, .getPosts, and we call initiate, and it gets that initial data and requests it at that point. And so then we can load that data once again as the app starts up. Okay, with the changes we've made up to this point, now we're ready to go to that post list component and use the use get posts query custom hook that was generated from our get posts inside of the post slice, where we have the extended API slice. So now at the top here, we'll probably end up with some imports we're not going to use, but for now, I'll just put in the import that I know we are going to use, which is use get post query, coming from our post slice that's in the same folder. So that should just be ./post slice. So now inside the component, let's go ahead and use this use get post query hook, and you can see it has several different things here. It has is loading, is success, is error, and of course if we do have an error, we want to define that error. So that means we're not going to need some of these other things as well. So let's go ahead and at least remove the error that we know we're not going to use, and we'll see what else we're not using afterwards. This is going to change this just a little bit because we're using new indicators, but we don't have to change it a lot. So instead of looking for post status equals loading, we're just looking for is loading. And then instead of post status succeeded, we're just looking for is success. And then of course the else if post status equals failed, we're just looking for is error. And now let's see if we need to change anything else. I'll hit Control B so we can see this full line, but it pretty much will stay the same, I believe. So there is our new content. We're still using the ordered post IDs.map. Notice that was up here above, and that's because we're still using the selector select post IDs that we already modified and made sure that the new state is being found inside of that post slice file. So it looks like we can get rid of this post status that we've defined. And if we come up here at the top, it looks like we can get rid of get post status and get post error as well from the imports and save. Now I would normally check our post lists at this time, but we have changed so much about the post slice where our app will still be broken in many ways if we attempt to run it right now. So let's go ahead and keep making some changes. I'll go back to the file tree. One thing that I do want to quickly change that really has nothing to do with our RTK query normalized cache state or optimistic updates that we're applying today is the post author component. And I had just noticed really that we're not using a link on the author's name. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the link, import link from React Router DOM, and then inside of the author where we're just displaying the author name inside of this ternary right here, I'm just going to change this one line, and maybe we can break it into separate lines so we can see a little bit better. But essentially, if true, we're going to return this link instead of just the author name, so we're linking to the author page. Other than that, we're not changing anything else here in the post author. And this will be in the completed source code as well, but if you want to quickly make the change, it's just link from React Router DOM, and then it's providing the link to that user page with the user ID. We already have the routing in place. It's just something I hadn't previously added. Okay, let's go back to the post slice and continue to add these methods so we can eventually check our app and it won't be broken. So we've got get posts right here, but after get posts, we have a comma. We're ready to put in our next method. I'll scroll up because it will take up just as much room really. Paste this in and let's look at what this is. It's get posts by user ID. So it's going to be just a little different. We now have a query that is receiving an argument. So we set it up here with the parameter definition of ID, and this is going to request posts, and then it's going to have the user ID attached to this request. And so that will give us the post just from a specific user ID. We're using the transform response just as we did above here. So really the exact same concept, because we still need to add this information to the posts if it doesn't exist. And we're again using postAdapter.setAll. Now this does not overwrite the cache state of the request for the full list of posts, because Redux is subscribing to these different queries, which we'll be able to see when we complete if we use Redux DevTools, because now this will have a cache state for this specific query as well. And again, with the post adapter, we are normalizing this state. So it will also be normalized with an IDs array and then having each post inside of the entities object. Okay, we'll scroll down here and look at provides tags. Now, much like above, we're not giving an ID of the full list, but we are spreading the result that's ran through the map here. And look, we're using the IDs array, and then we have the post and the ID. So we could invalidate this query for any one of these queries, I guess any one of the users, because we would be looking at the individual posts. So if any one of those posts were invalidated in the future, it could know to invalidate this cache and rerun this query by auto fetching essentially. And now remember, each method that we add above here, so get post by user ID, creates another custom hook. So I'm just going to select all of this and paste in the change. what we've done is add the next custom hook, which is use get posts by user ID. That was the name we had, so it starts out with use and ends with query when this creates the custom hook. And now that we kind of know what we're doing here with the methods inside of this extended API slice, let's just go ahead and add the next method. And now this won't be a query, this will be a mutation. So we have builder.mutation. The previous ones were queries because we were just querying data, but now we're adding a new post. So our other methods, essentially updating, deleting, adding, any of those things will be mutations. Here we're passing in a post, and I named this initial post because that's essentially what it is. And we'll be posting to that /posts URL. So the method is post. And then we're just adjusting a couple of things here. So we're actually spreading in the post object, and then we're overriding the user ID, making sure it's a number and not a string as we post it. We are adjusting the date, and we're setting the reactions. This is a new post, so all the reactions would be 0. Now, a huge difference here from the queries, as we perform a mutation, we're using invalidates tags instead of provides tags. And this is going to invalidate the list. There's no individual post because this post didn't already exist, but it would be part of the list, so this should invalidate the post list cache. Okay, scrolling up again for some more room, and we'll put the next one, which is the update. So this update post is once again a builder mutation. Once again receives that post object, and notice now, since this is an update, I'm getting the ID property from that initial post object. This is a put method that we're using. We're spreading in the original post, and then we're going ahead and updating the date. Everything else will already exist because it was already a pre-existing post. So here we don't have to worry about it actually having those other bits of data that we were adding before here as we queried the data and then put it inside of our cache. So now once we update, we're just updating the state. This is going to invalidate tags as well. It's going to invalidate whichever post ID was there. And so instead of just the result here, we're using the argument because the argument was that initial post. So we're saying argument.id, just like we say initial post.id right here. And finally, let's go ahead and add the delete as well. So let's put the delete post right here. It's much the same. Now we're not getting the full post as the argument. So this parameter just needs to be the ID. So what we can do is destructure the ID that we're getting from the post. We don't need the rest of the post anywhere. And then we're just passing that ID here to the URL. It's posts/ID. So we have that specific ID, and that's what we're deleting. And of course here we're providing that ID in the body of the request. Once again, just like the update, it's the argument, and so the argument is going to be this object. Now we're not destructuring here, so we're saying argument.id. And with our methods all now in place, we just need to update our exports here. I'm going to once again just select all of these and paste over, but you can see we've added the add new post mutation. So because these are not queries, they are mutations, they end in mutation. They still begin with the word use. So we created add new post, and the hook created is use add new post mutation. The same for use update post mutation and use delete post mutation. Let's save these changes, and now we can move on to the components. So I'll go back to the file tree, and we're ready to make changes to not the post list. I went there by habit, but we're going to change the add post form component. I'll press Control B to hide the file tree once again, and we're going to start out with an import, and we need to import that mutation we created. So this will be the use add new post mutation that comes from the post slice. Now we will no longer use dispatch, so I'm just going to highlight that and paste over it, and we'll bring in this add new post function from our use add new post mutation. Notice I'm also bringing in an isLoading variable here, and so we can use that as well when we create our content, so we can use it conditionally. And now that we're doing that, we're not going to bring in add new post from the post slice. That has been removed already. And we're also not going to bring in use dispatch, so I can get rid of that from the imports as well. And now we can get rid of our add request status. We won't be using that state anymore. where we have use state set to idle. So we can remove that line of code. And now I'll go ahead and scroll down, and we're going to be inside of our on save post click function. What we won't do anymore is set the add request status. We've removed that state, and we will no longer dispatch add new post like we see here. So I'm going to select both of these and replace it with what we will now do, and this is await. So we need to change our on save post to async. And now we're going to await our add new post function that we're bringing in from our use add new post mutation. And then we'll pass in the post. So we'll have the title, the body with the content that we're creating, and then we'll have the user ID here as well. We'll still use unwrap because we're still in a try catch block. But now we can also remove this finally block from the try catch block because we're no longer using the add request status. And one final change in our add post form, and that is going to be to replace the add request status we were checking here. As we set the can save value, that's now going to check is loading, and we want to make sure it is not loading, and that's when can save should work. So let's go ahead and save. And now back to the file tree, we're going to make changes that are nearly identical to our edit post form, but our edit post form is going to be able to update and delete, so that makes a change or two as well. The first thing we'll do is import our mutations, and now we have two mutations, so you can see we're using use update post mutation and use delete post mutation. I'll hide the file tree again with Control B. And once again, inside the component, let's go ahead and use both of those. So I'll paste that right here, and we're bringing in the update post function and once again an is loading status from the update, and then we're bringing in a delete post function from that use delete post mutation hook as well. After that, we will not need the dispatch, so we can remove that, and once again we will not need the request status or set request status state, so we can remove that too. And it looks like I've got an extra line I'll remove. Now I'll go ahead and scroll up, and we should be changing some of the same things here as well. So on can save, once again, we are going to change that request status idle that we're no longer using state for to just making sure that is loading is not true. Now I'll scroll up a little more. We need to change our on save post click here to an async function. We'll once again remove the set request status and the dispatch, and I'll replace that with an await update post, and here we pass in the post once again that is being created, and once again we use unwrap because we're inside of a try catch block. Now we can remove the finally block from the try catch block as well. But we're not quite finished because that's just saving the update. So we need to scroll down because we also have on delete post clicked, which will also make an async function. We'll remove the set request status and the dispatch here as well. And in this place, we'll put the await delete post. And here we just pass in the post ID because if you remember, that's all that's needed back in our extended API slice. We're using unwrap here as well because it's in the try catch block, and we can remove the finally as well. Now there's one more big component change we need to make, so we'll go back to the file tree, but this is not in the post folder at all. It's actually in the users folder, and it's going to be on the user page. Remember, we're getting posts by the user ID, so we can display them, of course, on the user page. So that's what we're going to do here. Let's go ahead and add the import we need, and that's going to be use get posts by user ID query. So we're coming up out of the users folder, into the post folder, and grabbing that post slice where that new custom hook is created by RTK query. I'm going to hide the file tree once again. We will not need this import with select all posts or select posts by user. So we can go ahead and remove that import, and below we'll bring in our hook right where we define posts for user. So let's just paste over that. And now you can see with the get posts by user ID query, and we're passing in the user ID that we get from use params with React Router. So once we have that, we're defining the data we get from this hook as posts for user, so it can replace what we were doing. And now we have that same status that we did before, so we can conditionally render our components. So we have is loading, is success, is error, and then of course error if there is an error. And now our content is going to change somewhat. So what I'm going to do is just select the post titles and paste over it where we create our content, and we're actually going to call it content. So while I'm thinking of it, I'll come down here in the JSX and just paste our content in here instead where we have post titles. So we'll just change that to content. Okay, to break this down up above, we're defining content, and then we're checking those different progresses. So we have is loading. So if that's true, we're just going to change the content to a loading status. Then we have is success. And this is where it gets a little more complicated, because remember, we now have normalized state. So our posts for users, the data that we receive, has that IDs array. And then it has the entities object that has all of the individual posts for the user. So we're destructuring that right here, and we're mapping over the IDs array. Now for each ID, we can create a list item, and we're going to link to the post. But then when we get to the content here and we need the title, we have to use that entities object as a lookup object. So we pass in the ID, and that gives us the specific post. It's an object lookup, and then we can reference the title. And then our final, of course, is if is error is true, then we display the error. And that's all the changes we need to make. Well, at least that's all the changes we need to make for this component. Let's go ahead and move back to the file tree, because we have just a couple of more changes to make before everything is going to work in our application. One area we need to fix, and this is just left over from the previous tutorial, is the header.js, because we're going ahead and importing in increase count and get count when we just displayed something in that tutorial about count, and we don't really need it here. And of course the dispatch and setting count here as well, we're not going to use any of that. So let's go ahead and remove those. Let's remove the button that had the count, because it's really not a feature we need in our blog that we're going to use. And that means we don't need the imports of use dispatch and use selector. So if you have that in your starter code, you can remove everything to do with the count outside or inside of the header component. So we just removed all of that. And now the last thing we really need to do is move on to the reactions. And that is inside of the posts directory here inside of features. And we'll go to the reaction buttons.js, but we're also going to have to go back to that post slice where our extended API slice is, and make one more method here inside of the extended API slice. Now this is a larger method that I'm going to put in here, so we'll definitely break it down after I paste it in. And here it is. So we'll scroll up here. We've got add reaction. It is once again a builder mutation, but we don't want to reload our list every time we add a reaction. So we're going to do this differently. And this is what is called an optimistic update. And that's what we're going to perform here. So I'll press Control B to hide the file tree again, and let's break this all down. First, we have a query, and this query is going to receive a post ID and the reactions. Notice we're destructuring those from the object being sent in. Okay, then we have the URL that's just going to posts with the post ID. The method is going to be patch. Now, notice this note right here, and this comes directly from the docs example as well, and they're absolutely right. It says in a real app, we'd probably need to base this on the user ID somehow, so a user can't do the same reaction more than once. And that is true. With this current setup, a user will be able to have a reaction more than once. What we're doing differently from the docs example is they were just passing in the individual reaction and incrementing it because they didn't give this example with normalized state. I'm passing in all of the reactions for the post, and then we're going to replace the existing reactions with the reactions that are passed in. Okay, once we have that, and that would typically be what we would do, but now notice we have an onQuery started handler. Now this is a little different. We're once again passing the post ID and the reactions, just like we did above with the query. But then it has a second parameter as well. That parameter has some things in there we can use. One is dispatch, and another is query fulfilled, which is a promise. And so we're going to look at that to know some status as well. Now our note, update query data, it says it requires the endpoint name and cache key arguments so it knows which piece of cache state to update. Well, that's what we're going to do right down here. So we're defining patch result, then we're using dispatch that we got from the second parameter up here of the onQuery started handler. And what we're going to dispatch is extended API.util, which we hadn't seen before, and then we can get this update query data. And there is where we pass in the endpoint. Now we have undefined here for that cache key argument, I believe, but we do have the endpoint, and that's all we really need. But the draft is a draft of our data. So this is Immer wrapped. So we're once again using Immer.js like we did inside of Create Slice. And the data here can be mutated because then Immer.js will handle it correctly for us. So what I'm going to do is define the post and set it equal to draft.entities. Remember, this is a draft of our data, and our data has the IDs array and the entities object. And I'll pass in that post ID. So this is an object lookup again. So I'm getting that specific post. And then if that post exists, I'm setting the reactions to the reactions that we passed in to this builder mutation. And so that would normally be a mutation here, but Immer.js is going to handle that correctly for us. Now, after we do all of that, what happens is we await for that promise to fulfill, the promise that was in the parameter here, so query fulfilled. Otherwise, we're going to undo this patch, and that's if it catches an error there, it will undo it. And that is because this is an optimistic update. So what we're really doing inside of this patch result here is updating our cache, and that is happening optimistically, possibly before the data at the API has been updated. So we're instantly seeing that in our UI. What happens is we click on the reaction and it instantly updates, and then you see the network request go to the API to go ahead and update that data so it will match what we already see in our UI. But if it fails for any reason, then it will undo what we have changed inside of our cache, our data as well. So that is why we look for query fulfilled, and we hope it fulfills. But if for some reason it doesn't, just because we've optimistically updated doesn't mean that it cannot be undone. So that's how that works, an optimistic update. And I know it's a little bit more complicated than just sending and receiving data from the API, and of course updating our state with that as well. But we're optimistically updating our cache possibly before the data is received at the API with this setup. And then a final note on this add reaction. Notice we're not using invalidates tags anywhere with this. And that is because we don't want to refetch the list every time a reaction is added. So we're not going to invalidate any post or list. What we're going to do is optimistically update the cache already and not have to do another request, but we are going to update the data at the API as well. Okay, let's save these changes, and now let's move to the add reaction, or I'm sorry, the reaction buttons component. And what we're going to do is add reaction. So we can remove this import use dispatch and import reaction added from the post slice. We'll no longer need those. What we will import is the use add reaction mutation from the post slice. Now let's go ahead and remove dispatch from the component itself, and we'll replace that with calling our use add reaction mutation hook and getting the add reaction function from it. Now I'm going to scroll up, and we're just going to change a little bit about our button. We will still use object.entries, and we'll still use the reaction emoji here and map over it with the name and the emoji. No changes there. The button will still have a key that's the name, type button, class name, reaction button, but our on click will definitely change. So let's go ahead and replace the on click, And you can see what we're doing now is defining a new value, and we're getting the post.reactions name and adding 1 to it. So that's the new value. Then when we add reaction, we're passing in all of the reactions. So we've got the post ID that we need that's passed in, and then the reactions here. So we spread in the post reactions, and then we overwrite the current reaction with that new value. And so now it will have the increment for that one reaction. Then down here, everything should still be the same. We've got emoji, post.reactions, and the name that shows. And our JSX just shows the reaction buttons. So that's all good. We can save those changes. I think we're just about ready to try out our application. Let's go back to the post slice. I'm thinking after I discussed this add reaction, which is the builder mutation that's fairly large, we didn't go ahead and add it to our export here of the different custom hooks. So let's do that as well. This would be use add reaction mutation. So now let's save that. Okay, let's open up a command line. Remember, we have got our JSON server running at the other command line. So we open up a second one now. And here I'm going to type npm start, and this should fire up our blog. So let's see what we get for our blog in the web page. It was loading, and now we have our blog. It looks like everything's good. See if we can view a post. We're viewing the post. We can view the author page and see other posts from that author. So that all looks good. Let's see a list of users. That's good. And remember, we have not changed our users over from the async thunk and the user slice that we created before. That's going to be your assignment at the end of this tutorial. Then you can look at my completed code on GitHub to match that up. But while we have this open, let's go ahead and see if we can add some reactions, and they increment quickly. That's great. So everything is working as we expect. Now let's go ahead and look here at this in DevTools, this application in DevTools, and we'll open up Redux here. So now we can check some of our state and see what's being used in the state. I wish I had just a little bit more room, but overall we have the API and we have users in the state. So let's look at the API, and then it has queries. And if we open up the queries, you can see get posts has been used, and then we used get posts by user ID. And then they both keep their own information. So then we'll have data from that get posts. And inside here, we see the data has the IDs array and the entities. If we look at the IDs array, it's just an array of ID numbers. And then the entities is an array, or not an array, actually, it's an object, but it has the number 2 and then the object assigned to it. So if we drop that down, then you see ID2 title. You'll see the full post. Entity has each one, but it's also an object with a number as it goes. So that's why we can use it as an object lookup with the IDs. And then any changes we make, we can look at the differences, and you can also see what the state is subscribed to or the different actions. So Redux DevTools, linked to in the description, is very, very useful as well. But now let's go to the network tab and see what we get here when we make different requests. Right now, we'll request the home page. There's no more network request there because we've already got those post lists. So now let's go ahead and go to Leanne Graham's page, and notice then we had a user ID equal 1 request, and that was a fetch. So we got that data, and we can look at an individual post. If we go back to Leanne's page, no other network request. It didn't happen again because it gets it from the cache. Now, if we go to the users and request another user ID, then we see that user ID equal to 10, and now that is also cached. So now we have 2 cached queries there for users. We can look at an individual post there, but if we go back to that user, we don't see another request. If we go back to users here, go back to Leanne Graham, we don't see another request because we already have that data here. Now, it will eventually expire, and Redux handles that for us as well. Remember that middleware handles those expirations. So you can see how efficient this would be. Now, if we change something, say we update a post, so let's view the post, then let's choose edit post, and here I'll just change the text of the post to testing, and then I'll save that. Now you can see several things happen. We had a pre-flight request here with this post, and then there was the fetch, and you can see it was actually a put request that was sent, and we got 200 for that. And then that caused the posts to invalidate the cache, so the posts were once again fetched at that point. So there you can see how everything is working, and you can play around with that in Redux DevTools and also look at the network tab. But it's all working as expected. Congratulations if you followed me all the way through to the end of this project. You now have a fully functioning blog that has integrated normalized cache state, and it has some optimistic updates, which is something else we didn't do there, but we can go ahead and do the reactions. I guess open the console back up. Now we should see a network request for every reaction. And there we see that. So if I do it again, we'll continue to see that. One was a pre-flight request, but the others were fetch. And we're doing the optimistic updates. So notice it updates here immediately, and then we see the request. So overall, we've implemented a lot of things here with Redux Toolkit and RTK Query. We've got React going, normalized state, optimistic updates. Congratulations on making it to the end of this. I hope it's given you a good start with Redux Toolkit. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection. And a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.